Our talk today is serving a couple of different functions, which I will explain. For those of you who don't know me, I don't normally sound like this, but it does explain why I'm not there in person. My name is Dr. Amy Krupel, and I'm the director of the UF Center for European Studies. The Center for European Studies is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and a Title VI National Resource Center for Europe. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's discussion is recorded and will be available on the UFCES website. We also will have a Q&A session following the presentation, and participants can submit questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We do ask that you use the question and answer function as opposed to the chat function. Our talk today is on structural transformation and populism. And this talk is officially part of our Lunchtime Symposium series, but it is also a practice job talk in collaboration with the Department of Political Science. We host 3 to 4 Lunchtime Symposiums a semester for faculty and advanced graduate students to present current research on Europe from any discipline. And if you have a European topic that you would like to present, please contact us. You can do so at our website, www.ces.ufl.edu. Our speaker today is Michael Webb. He is a Ph.D. candidate in political science, and his research interest is in political discontent, populism, and the structural factors that drive contemporary change in political systems in the US and Europe and EU institutions. Specifically, the informal agenda-setting capacity of the European Parliament in terms of his EU-related research. His current work and his dissertation focuses on the usefulness of varying measures of industry mixture as a determination of economic voting behavior and, in particular, voting support for populist parties. And with that, I will hand this over to Mike. I will be muting myself and stopping my video so that we focus all of our attention on Michael. I do encourage you as you leave to fill out the survey, if you wouldn't mind, for the Center for European Studies. And with that, Michael, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Krupel. Okay, yeah. So as Dr. Krupel mentioned, my name is Mike Webb. I'm a PhD candidate in the Political Science Department at the University of Florida. And today I'll be presenting my talk, which is entitled Economic Structure and Populism, and which pertains to the work that I'm currently doing for my dissertation. So a little bit about me before we get started. I have 2 general areas of focus in my research. One that I'm not focusing on today, and that Dr. Krupel mentioned, is what I would describe as document-driven institutional analysis. And this research is principally driven by the idea that we can learn something about the informal character of governance in the European Union, the way that EU institutions interact with one another within the bounds of the sort of formal procedures of governance, by analyzing the tens of thousands of documents that are published every year, looking at the ways in which institutions reference one another, looking at the sentiment in those documents. And so it's an area of research that I'm pretty passionate about, and that I think is pretty exciting, and I'd be happy to talk about as well if anyone is interested. But today I'll be focusing on my other area of interest, which is economic structure and political behavior. And this work is really oriented around the idea that there is significant variation in the character of local economies, and that this variation has implications for political behavior, and that we can learn something about it, and that it can help us to understand better the nature of contemporary political phenomenon. And the one that I focus on in this context is the success of populist candidates. So the principal question that my work orients itself around is how is populist success connected to variation in economic structure? But to answer that question, we have to define our terms. And so that means distinguishing between economic structure and economic performance and settling on a definition of populism. So without further ado, I want to begin by talking about structural transformation. And structural transformation is connected to economic structure in the sense that when economic structure changes, we are experiencing structural transformation. And this is something that actually has a really rich legacy in political science. There are a lot of theorists that have spoken to this idea, specifically in relation to the transition from an agricultural to an industrial economy in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And also, I think, in developing countries, economic development and regional differences remain a really relevant issue for the questions of political stability and the questions of political behavior. And so one of the things that my work does is ask if it matters for developing countries and if it has mattered historically, why shouldn't it matter today in the context of populism? And there's a lot of work outside of political science that's been done by geographers and economists, which speaks to the impact of economic change, but tends to focus at the regional level. And we have a lot of terms for describing the transformation that we're currently experiencing: urbanization, automation, agglomeration, liberalization, globalization. And all of these terms have different meanings depending on who you ask, but they point to this kind of incredibly complex pattern of change which is taking place in the economies of the West, and honestly taking place in every economy all the time. But it becomes particularly salient at different moments, and that's sort of one of the things that I'm trying to wrestle with in my work. And one of the trends that's emerged in the West today actually is significant variation within states. What one economic geographer terms the economic balkanization of Europe and the United States, as some spaces become incredibly wealthy, are able to take advantage of new sectors that benefit from new technologies, while others fall increasingly behind. And that leads to a rather varied economic experience for the individuals living in those spaces, and consequently, or perhaps potentially, I suppose I should say, has implications for the political behavior of those individuals. So normally when we talk about the economy, and often when we talk about the economy in reference to something like populism, we're talking about economic performance. And economic performance is a really valuable and important perspective to bring to the question, in the sense that understanding the vitality of an economy can give us a sense of how individuals are experiencing it. But there is more to the nature of an economy than simply its current productive capacity or the degree to which people are employed. We also can ask a bunch of other questions, which relate specifically, I think, to the kind of work that is being done in those economies, the kind of production that takes place, because not all production is created equal. If you work in an oil field, or you work in a town that is highly dependent on some other extractive industry, you're going to have a largely different experience from a city where individuals are engaged in information and communication services. And honestly, the performance of these different spaces and those different sectors will also vary. And so in a sense, we can actually think of any given economy as actually being a patchwork of different local economies that have different sectoral dependencies and consequently are experiencing different levels of performance at different times. And so in a way, economic structure is almost answering the question of what does the economy look like? So not just how is the economy doing, but what sort of economy are we talking about? To what degree do we want to wrestle with the complexity? And this is not an entirely new idea. Cleavage theory talks about the difference between rural and urban spaces, and those differences are to some extent driven by the differences in agricultural and industrial economic activity. This was certainly a key dynamic in the transition from agriculture to industry in the 19th and 20th century. Today, economies are a lot more complex. And so I think the question becomes harder to answer, the patterns become harder to discern, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the same sort of dynamics aren't in play. So I'd like to present to you what I conceive of as two different axes of variation in economic structure. On the one hand, individuals and economies are separated by space. So we could conceive of an economy simply as a national economy, but we could also think about how a national economy is actually divided into regional economies, how that regional economy is divided into municipal or county economies, and then how the individual who lives in a set space is actually experiencing the national economy filtered through these smaller subnational economies that they have more direct contact with. At the same time, economies are also divided sectorally, because ultimately an individual experiences the economy through the work that they engage in. If you're a lawyer, you're not going to have the same economic experience as a professor. By the same token, if you worked at Kodak cameras when the digital camera was invented, you had a very bad time economically when a lot of the rest The rest of the economy was doing relatively well. If you worked in digital advertising, if you worked in social media in 2009, you did very well when the rest of the country did very badly. And the point of this is to suggest that when we look at aggregate trends, we're actually losing some degree of understanding of the extent to which economic performance will vary depending on the space and character, or the place and character of an individual's economic engagement. This is a map that sort of drives home this idea. On the left-hand side, you have the industrial composition of Europe taken at a sort of supranational level. So the different kinds of jobs that people work in. On the right-hand side, you have a map of Europe presenting the same information, but with the principal industry for each of the subregions coloring the particular space. And so you'll notice a pretty substantial degree of variation. There are spaces that are primarily engaged in professional and scientific services. And there are entire countries where those services dominate. But there are also countries and spaces where agriculture or manufacturing are much more relevant. And this has implications because these different sectors are going to have different degrees of economic success. And so even if you don't happen to work in this sector, you are dependent on it to the extent that the economy that you live in, the economic ecosystem that you take part in is dependent on those industries. So if manufacturing is doing badly and you live in northern Italy, there's a fair chance that you will have a sense that the economy is not doing well, even if the Italian economy as a whole is performing. Another thing to consider as we talk about economic structure is that it is not static. I started by talking about structural transformation. And one of the most salient narratives around our contemporary transformation is the transition out of industry, out of manufacturing, and towards service and information-oriented technologies. The economists who study structural transformation believe that since the 1970s, with the creation of digital computing, we've been in a state of structural transformation. And I think what's especially interesting about this is that the rate at which technology is advancing is increasing. It's not slowing down. And this means potentially that we may just find ourselves in a sort of persistent state of structural transformation. And so it will be important to understand how changing economies manifest across space, how individuals engage in those economies, and what the implications are for political behavior. And now we get to the second half of the question that I posed initially, and we can ask, what does it have to do with populism? Before we can do that, though, I think we have to define populism. And the definition that I choose to take up stands at odds with a lot of what the literature in political science works with, but I think they are entirely reconcilable. Most individuals studying populism within political science work under the dominant paradigm of the minimalist or ideational definitions, which is this idea that populists divide society into a pure people and a corrupt elite, or some other malicious other. And it's typically expressed in Manichaean terms. So there's a real good-bad divide going on. But these definitions tend to be primarily actor-oriented, and they are descriptive in that sense. We could point to a populist simply based on attributes specific to that individual. And that's very useful for the purposes of studying populists, but it doesn't lead us to a theory of why populists succeed or why they emerge in the first place. And this is not to say that those individuals studying this from the minimalist perspective don't have those theories, they certainly do, but it doesn't sit front and center in their work, and I believe that structure as a whole ends up being downplayed in this study of populism generally in political science, because we do take such an actor-centered focus, and that actor-oriented focus really does start with the definition of populism that we choose to take up. A separate, less popular definition of populism is the structurally oriented relational version that Laclau provides. And what I mean when I say relational is that to understand who a populist is from Laclau's perspective within his sort of logic of populist action, we have to understand the system that the populist operates in. From Laclau's perspective, populists are answering a failure of representation. They take advantage of a discontented populace and channel a whole set of discontents into an empty signifier, into which anybody who is feeling bad about the existing regime, who is discontented with the existing regime, can find something they identify with and support. And one of the ways in which Laclau believes that these discontents can emerge is through economic development. And the reason for this is that the economy changes, the structure of society changes, and institutions are slow to respond. And in this sense, we can look at the version of populism that Laclau provides as a form of political instability. Populism is a relational term, as actors who are taking advantage of political discontent to challenge the existing regime, to present a new political identity, are more like rebels than they are like a specific kind of political party. And I think that this is especially interesting because you'll notice at the start of this talk, I talked about the history of economic development and economic structure and its importance within the context of a legacy of works like The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi or Political Order and Changing Societies by Samuel Huntington, which focused on the connection between political stability generally and economic development. And so what I want to argue for here is that if we understand populism as a kind of political instability akin to a rebellion, but one that takes place through the party system instead of through violence, then we are actually arriving at a definition of populism that is places more emphasis on context and more emphasis on structure, and allows us to start to draw connections between political instability that we see elsewhere, other forms of political instability, like political instability in the developing world, or political instability that we've seen historically, into our present context. And that's really where my emphasis on economic structure comes from, is this understanding that the political instability we're seeing today is not novel. It just is a reflection of the institutions and structures that exist today, but is still beholden to many of the same causal elements that exist throughout the study of political science in relation to political stability. So I mentioned earlier that those operating within the minimalist or ideational definition of populism do have explanations or sort of theories of causal theories of populism. And these are, interestingly, they resonate with the idea that I'm presenting here, of populism as a relational term, a sort of specific form of political instability, which is contextually dependent. Populism is essentially an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism, is how Mude described it in a lecture that he gave in 2017, which was published in 2019, which is why the date is different. By the same token, Kaltwasser, who's another sort of major advocate of the minimalist definition, talks about how populism is ultimately a complaint that democratic representatives have violated the sacred trust. And he goes on to talk about how the specific trust that was violated in this context was actually the willingness of governments in Latin America to commit to austerity measures demanded by international institutions over the preferences and demands of the people living in those spaces. And so what is at the core of these arguments and what is at the core of the argument that I just presented is the idea that populism is a reaction to representational failure in some way. But the question then becomes, what way? In what sense has representation failed? And that's where we start to get to the different kinds of explanations for why populists succeed. One explanation is cultural backlash, and this is the idea that there are a set of individuals in the West who have historically dominated in what was once a much more homogeneous and less diverse, less pluralistic society. So old white men, I think, is the traditional archetype. These individuals react to pluralism. They react to diversity, which they react to democratic governance, which protects those values, and say, okay, we want an authoritarian leader that's willing to step in and ensure that we remain in power, and we're ready to give up the hegemonic norm of democracy in order to do that. On the other hand, there are a set of arguments which point to the importance of economics and the importance of structure. And some of these arguments have been made in political science, but the two literatures tend to stay relatively isolated. There are those who advocate for populism as something which exists within the individual, something which is very actor-oriented. And there are those who advocate for populism as a reaction to structural changes. And it's certainly possible that both arguments have legs to stand on, that they're bringing important things to this question. And that is where the separation between these two literatures is something that I seek to address in my work, because I believe that the demographic changes that have been identified as being relevant and salient to understanding the advance of populism are very important, because obviously parties need to engage in salient narratives to find success. And those narratives are going to be bound up in things like demographic changes. But at the same time, there are real structural economic changes taking place that are largely focused on in economics, or by political scientists working with economists, or by economic geographers. And what needs to happen is that, from my perspective, these two literatures talk to each other more directly. So the quote at the top of this slide comes from one of the authors from the minimalist tradition, talking about the value of economic variables for explaining populist attitudes. And I think this really speaks to the degree to which, within the minimalist ideational definition, the importance of the economy is downplayed. But part of the reason for this is that economic performance supplants the economy as the basis for accounting for economic factors. And another example of this trend comes from another scholar in the ideational or minimalist discipline, I suppose you could say, who argued that one of the reasons why economic explanations of populism don't work is that they can't provide a unified theory for why populism succeeded in Latin America and also succeeded in Europe. But in reality, the economies of Latin America and Europe are drastically different. They're different in terms of their sectoral composition, in terms of the historic legacies that they are descended from. And in that sense, I don't think we can really say, just by looking at economic performance, that economic factors can't help to explain the success of populist or anti-establishment candidates. And importantly, the two strands of populism are not talking to one another. The two strands of explanation for populism are not talking to one another. But there is also a certain disconnect between the way the economy is handled in studies of populist success, with the focus on economic performance, and the understanding of what it matters in terms of political stability and economic development within political science generally. There's been several important pieces of work which have highlighted the value of economic structure as an explanatory element for understanding political stability. And so what I want to take away from this discussion of economic structure and of populism and of the way that we explain populist success is that more work needs to be done to connect change in structure, variation in structure to the success of populist candidates. So this leads to a whole host of questions, some of which I answer in my dissertation and some of which I hope to answer in the future. I believe this is a fairly fruitful space for doing research. And it's all oriented around this idea that economic variation, structural economic variation, could potentially have implications for political behavior. The question that I'm going to focus on today is whether governments can do anything about significant disparities in economic development within their own countries. And I'll be focusing on what I think is an interesting case in the context of the EU. And it's interesting for a number of reasons, which I will get into right now. So the EU has set up a special fund, which is specifically meant to address the disparate economic circumstances of the varying regions under its supranational umbrella. And between 2000 and 2013, they've distributed almost $500 billion in, or €500 billion in economic support to various initiatives in various regions across Europe. And they're all oriented around the idea of bringing these economies up to speed. And in the analysis that I'm about to show you, I focus on support for the EU and Euroscepticism. And I believe that Euroscepticism and populism are actually quite closely connected. Many of the parties which run as Eurosceptic parties in European Parliament elections are populist parties in their own right. And also the general dynamic of anti-establishment attitudes towards this supranational institution, which is engaged in sort of a massive project of economic transformation in the case of the single market, is a really interesting space to learn and study the implications of economic structure for political behavior. Specifically, I think it is especially useful because you have this variation in political systems, a variation in parties that are all held to the same standards in terms of their engagement internationally, in terms of trade and also in terms of the way that their monetary policy is handled. So I take a two-pronged approach to this analysis, and I must say that it is relatively preliminary at this point. It's something that I'm still working on, but which I believe holds promise. The first is an econometric model, which is regionally focused. I've gathered up the EP election results from 2014 and 2019 through programmatic data collection, because although every country in the EU is obligated to publish its European Parliament results, they aren't obligated to present them in a particularly accessible way. So for some of these results, you can't download them directly. And for none of them are presented in a single place. Every country has its own page where it includes its results. So gathering up EP election results is more arduous than you would expect it to be. But the general point of the analysis is to look for support for the EU by voting for a strongly pro-EU party, which I define as a party that receives a pro-EU chess score of 7 or above, and which has a salience for the EU that is at least a 3 out of, I think it's 5, but I would have to double check if anyone's really concerned. The second approach that I take is hierarchical and aims to better understand whether or not or how European Regional Development Fund spending is connected to individual behavior and individual attitudes, and also how economic structural variables are in play when it comes to support for the EU as a sort of establishment institution, and also the likelihood of voting for an anti-elite party in a domestic election. And so this is support for populist candidates. It also allows us to ask the question, does European Regional Development Fund spending also provide benefits to domestic governments? So not only does it drive support for the EU, but does it drive support for establishment parties generally? So these are sort of hard to interpret tables, so I will not spend too much time on them. But the big takeaway is that European Regional Development Fund spending is significantly positively associated with support for the EU in the electorate at large. And this is encouraging, but not necessarily causal. And I think a lot of the work that I'm doing here, because it does look at this problem from such a high level, is pointing to spaces that need further investigation, which ultimately I think is a good thing because it means more opportunities for more research. But what I'm hoping to show is that, and what I hope you take away from this slide, is that support for the EU is, at least at the regional level, strongly positively correlated with European Regional Development Fund spending. And that is true even when controlling for variance at the country level. So I do include fixed effects. And this is something that suggests that it's not simply a function of the higher levels of support that we see for the EU generally in countries from that joined the EU later, and which are typically do receive larger levels of funding. I'm now moved on to the individual level analyses, and this one looks specifically at the EU feeling thermometer. You sort of have to search for the ERDF variable on here, and I'm sorry for that. Unfortunately, the package that I used to put this table together is no longer being maintained, and the function that lets you order the variables is broken. But if you look, the ERDF variable is the sixth from the bottom, and you'll see that it is positively and significantly associated with support for the EU at the individual level. And also something that I think is exciting that you can take away from this table is that the industry mixture of the region that an individual lives in also has implications for the degree to which an individual supports the EU, and that these are not entirely insubstantial effects. Whoops, sorry, I was talking about the other table. I apologize. This in this table, you can see that the sector that an individual is employed in actually has a rather strong effect on their likelihood of supporting the EU. So individuals who are engaged in professional or scientific services are much more likely to support the EU, while those engaged in agriculture or manufacturing are less likely to be very positively disposed. And this is in keeping with the general narrative that exists in the literature around structural transformation, which emphasizes the pro-establishment attitudes of urban spaces, of successful urban spaces, and the increasingly discontented attitude of less successful urban and rural spaces. The next models that I'm going to show you are looking at the likelihood an individual will vote for a populist party. And this is based on a chess score of any party which has a anti-elite sentiment chess score higher than 8. So it's really only capturing those sort of parties that we would distinctly identify as populist. And what stands out to me is that, first of all, we no longer see a positive significant effect for the European Regional Development Fund spending we see no effect at all, in fact. And this suggests that while European Regional Development Fund spending has successfully increased support for the EU in European Parliament elections and has or I guess I shouldn't use causal language here, I should say, we can see that it's encouraging in the sense that where before we saw positive and significant associations between European Regional Development Fund spending, both at the regional and at the individual level, and EU sentiment, here we don't see any relationship at all. And I think if European Regional Development Fund spending was simply capturing was simply serving as a proxy for some structural effect, then we would continue to see it at play in this additional measure of anti-establishment sentiment, but we see no effect whatsoever. At the same time, we do see, again, some rather large and significant effects based on the sector that individuals are employed in, and also significant effects in relation to the concentration of employment in specific sectors that the individuals are living in. And ultimately, the direction of the effects is in keeping with the broader theoretical narratives that exist around what economic and structural transformation in the West today looks like, or in Europe and the United States today looks like. Individuals living in spaces with higher levels of professional or scientific employment are less likely to vote for an anti-elite party. Individuals with higher levels of manufacturing or agriculture are more likely. But I think that this is again, something that will have to be investigated much more carefully before we can make strong causal claims, but it is certainly evidence which perhaps justifies those further investigations. This is a very similar chart. In both models, I'm allowing one of the effects to vary. In the first, it was gender, and here it's college education. There's not really too much additional to say on this slide because the change in the effects is really quite small. But what's interesting to look at is the connection between variation in those effects that I allowed to vary and some of these economic structure variables that I'm interested in. So on the left-hand side, you have a map which shows sort of spatially variation in the strength of the effect of a college education in Austria. And on the right, you have a map that shows level of professional scientific employment. And in the middle, you have a scatter plot, which sort of charts the connection between the two. And this is interesting, I think, because it speaks to the extent to which the demographic variables, which we have historically focused on, and for explaining populism, this chart doesn't disprove that at all. In fact, I mean, you can see that across the spectrum of economic structure, those variables still matter. But what stands out to me, and what I believe points to the need for further research on this question, is the fact that you see rather significant variation in the strength of demographic effects across the economic landscape of this one specific country that we're looking at here, Austria. And what's especially interesting about this to me is that if we do the same thing with Italy, we actually see a complete reversal of the relationship between the two variables. So in Austria, the more heavily invested your region is in the professional and scientific sectors, the less significant the effects of education are, or rather, the more significant the effects of education are, I'm sorry. Whereas in Italy, the more heavily invested your region is in the professional and scientific sector, the less significant the effects of education are. The less the association there is there at least. I'm a little hesitant to ascribe too much significance to these results because these are estimated parameters that I'm constructing this correlation with. But I think it's exciting in the sense that we are seeing clear patterns in variation here. And the standard errors for the college educated, the effect of college education are really quite small. So I don't think it's having it would have too large of an effect on the character of the correlation. So in conclusion, having presented some of the findings from my research, I just want to point out the major takeaways that I'd like you to have after this presentation. The first is that European Regional Development Fund spending, which is specifically aimed at addressing some of the negative externalities, which are a function of structural transformation, and which fits within this sort of broader narrative of structural transformation, which has there are many theoretical arguments for in the West, strongly and positively associated with support for the EU. So it does appear to be having the effect that it's intended to have, both at the individual and at the regional level, although more research obviously needs to be done to confirm that this is actually taking place. And interestingly, and perhaps a measure of further validation in this respect, is that this benefit in terms of EU sentiment does not extend to national governments. So individual voting behavior at the national level, at least self-reported individual voting behavior at the national level, is not in any way associated with European Regional Development Fund spending at the regional level. A broader takeaway from all of these analyses is the extent to which economic structural variables are having effects on both political sentiments and political behavior, or self-reported political behavior, and that those effects are in keeping with the general narrative of sort of transformative change which is currently taking place. I also presented you with a series of plots which point to the extent to which one of the variables, which is often viewed as being very important for understanding populist success demographically, is itself influenced by the economic structure of different states. And ultimately, I think the arguments that I've made here and the work that I've shown you all point to the need for more research, which is exciting. I think creates the opportunity for a more refined understanding of how the economy connects to populism, and what populism as a form of political instability, as a form of political instability is specific to highly wealthy, I don't want to say highly developed, because I think every country in the world is still developing, as evidenced by the degree to which we can see economic change. But the extent to which wealthy states are experiencing political instability as a function of change in their economic structure. And this political instability is manifesting as populism. And that is my talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. Since we are a small group, I have decided to let folks ask their questions directly, also because the question in the question box is kind of long and my voice is not so great. So Michael, if you want to go ahead and ask your question out loud, you can. And if not, I'll ask Mike Webb to take a look at it.
I wrote, Laclau's discussion of populism comes in a period of expansion of middle class and working class sectors in Latin America in response to import substitution industrialization. It led to the first wave of democratization and expansion of public goods in the region. How does that work in the current age, where the populism in Western Europe is largely right-wing, growing out of an atmosphere of democratic backsliding and contraction of middle and working class groups, greater precarity, etc.? Or even in Latin America, where certain of the populist experiments have collapsed into kleptocracy and backsliding or even breakdown, e.g. Venezuela, Nicaragua.
And the question is, how does that work speak to what's going on currently?
It's a contextual approach to it, and it's designed for a rather different context. And so I'm wondering how you would adapt a contextual approach to a rather radically different set of conditions, I guess, is what I'm asking you.
Yeah, so when Laclau writes on populism, at least in his On Populist Reason, he talks about it as being a sort of more general theory of representation. I think he describes populism as the royal road to the political as such, I think is actually the direct quote. And so I think he certainly thought as being potentially extendable. And he wasn't really interested in the specific economic events that led to the discontent, which then led to the emergence of populist identities. But I think ultimately, what I'm interested in doing is focusing on that element of it, digging more deeply into the economic structure. And I don't have a specific answer to what the particular causal mechanisms are that are in play that distinguish representation, or the failures of representation in Latin America for the period when Laclau was speaking and for the work today, except to say that during periods of transition, during periods of transformation, the needs and expectations of individuals are changing, and governments are struggling to match up with those needs and understand them. And I think that speaks also to the work of somebody like Peter Mayer and cartelization, the failure of representation in the West. And so I think if there's a line to be drawn between these different examples, it's that the basic mechanic of failed representation is in play in all three spaces, or the desire to meet new needs and the incredible political power that comes with, or the incredible political momentum that comes with being able to match the needs of a discontented group that feel unrepresented in some way.
Just then to follow up real quick, is populism the only response to representation failure?
No, certainly not. I don't think so. I point to it as an example of political instability because I think ultimately representative failure is a much more general category. And that one of the benefits of looking at it in that way is that we can start to draw on some of the causal explanations for why representational failure occurs elsewhere, and then better understand what's going on in the West. And I think that is something that I'm trying to do in my work, is draw the connection between, try to better understand how economics in quote unquote developing states and the significance of the economy in quote unquote developed states are connected. And I think one of the ways in which they're connected is, or one of the ways of understanding how similar mechanics are in play in both places, despite the obvious differences, is by acquiring a more nuanced appreciation for the different their structural differences, so that we can then pay more attention to the significance of performance in those contexts.
Amy, I have a follow-up, but I want to let other people talk, so I will hold it off unless
Okay.
nobody else has a question.
No, we have a couple of questions from Brian Moraski. Brian, I've allowed you to speak if you'd rather just ask your questions, or I can read them.
Okay, so hey, Mike, nice to see you. So, I mean, listening to the first part of the presentation, well, I mean, I really like the visuals early on. I think those are nice representations of the kind of economic arguments that you're working with. It does sound like you're making the case the political scientists have got the economics wrong, and I just want to know, to what extent are the economists getting the politics right? One way to come away from the first part of your presentation is, well, we're just reading the wrong literature. The contribution is for understanding populism is coming from economics. And then my second question, unrelated perhaps, is you go through your results a little quickly, but I did notice in the first set of results, I think, that you presented, population density appears pretty influential. And I just wanted you to discuss why it's included and whether the negative effect that you see is what you expected. So anytime I see a multivariate analysis and one person focuses on a variable that's significant at the 0.05 level, and then I see other variables at the 0.001 level going on, and I'm not really sure why it's in there. I just want some follow-up on what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. To the question of whether political scientists are getting the economics wrong, I don't necessarily think that we are. I think what is happening is that ultimately these questions are incredibly complex, and that there are a lot of different things that could be focused on. There are political scientists who are focused on economic structure, and for the most part, they're just not also the political scientists who are focused on populism. Economists, for the most part, I think are not necessarily that interested in the political dynamics in play. When populism was really hot a couple of years ago, you saw a whole bunch of papers on the connection between these significant structural trends, which economists are very focused on, and the success of populist candidates. So I think ultimately it's not a question of whether or not individuals are getting these things wrong or right. It's just a question of making sure that for those of us who are interested in the politics of populism and who want to be able to account for the economics of it as well, we make sure we do provide a full accounting. And that I don't think is a failure necessarily, so much as it is just a question of there's a lot of literature out there that you have to read. And if you're focused on the importance of the individual, structure is generally going to be downplayed. And there are important findings that have come out of the focus on the individual. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not more that can be done. To your question about the population density, I was also somewhat surprised by that result, because I expected urban spaces to be more significantly connected to support for the EU. And I think ultimately what's going to have to happen, and something that I was trying to do for this presentation, I just wasn't able to make it happen, is switch over to a Bayesian form of hierarchical modeling, which would allow me to examine some of these small n differences, because I think what we're seeing in terms of difference with urban spaces may actually be speaking to variation across countries. And so I'm not entirely confident that we would see the same urban effects in Hungary that we see in Italy, that we see in Germany, that we would see in France. And so, as I mentioned, these are preliminary results, and I just need to investigate it further, I think would be my answer to your last question.
Okay, Mike Martinez has had his hand up.
Thanks, Mike. Good to see you. So in the second multi-level regression model you showed, if I was interpreting it correctly, your conclusion was that the that the ERDF spending per capita did not have a significant effect on the anti-elite vote. And I wondered if it might be the case that that effect would be contingent on where the individual is in the economic space, because I think I heard that's what you were arguing in your presentation, is that it should be. And so, I wondered if you think that is, right, if the effect of ERDF spending would be contingent on where the person is in the economic.
I think you may have muted yourself, Dr. Martinez.
It went. So I'm wondering whether that effect might be contingent on something like education or what sector the person is working in, right? Because that spending is probably targeted towards somebody, and I'm not. And so the other part of the question is your model well designed enough to be able to capture those kinds of targeted effects at the individual level?
So my answer to that is no. It's not well designed enough to do that. But those are great ideas. That would make perfect sense to me. That individuals. I've set the model up so that it is capturing the variation in the level of support that individuals find throughout space, because this is a variable which is attached at the regional level. But I'm not capturing the interaction between those. The significance of that spending at the regional level and the position of the individual sectorally or perhaps in terms of income. So that, to me, I think is that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I think a simple interaction term, either with education or income or sector, would be able to maybe allow you to detect that.
I will try that. That's a great idea. Thank you.
Okay, we now have a question from James Fahey. I've also allowed you to talk, or I can read your question, whichever you'd prefer, James.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So Mike, first off, I thought this was really interesting, and I've got a bunch of comments that I'll email to you later. But my question is a little bit more basic. So you talked a lot about how you classify populism as a sort of form of political instability, and this came after a long discussion where you talk about the ideational, and you kind of combine a strategic and ideational approach as sort of being more actor oriented, and then kind of contrast Laclau as a more structural explanation. But my understanding of that literature is that it's more about conceptualization. It's more about how do we define the bounds of what we're actually looking at. And that's why the ideational approach has become dominant, is it's really a response to Canavan's argument that we have a really hard time defining populism, and before we can explain what's happening, we have to know what we're actually comparing. You sort of talk about a lot of very different things here, and I think that Dr. Bernard's question is partially playing to that, right? That Laclau was talking about a very different context. So my really simple question is, in a Sartorian sense, what is the intention and extension of the term populism? What class of things does populism belong to? And what group of things are you looking at explaining with this model? Is it Eurosceptic protest parties, which you classify as populist? Is it a type of making an argument? What is populism in the sort of conceptual sense?
Yeah. So I think first to the distinction between actor-oriented and structure-oriented definitions of populism, or concept of populism, if we want to use that term. But I would say that they're exchangeable. Some of the work that I've seen done by I guess Kaltwasser would probably be the person who pushes this, but he co-authors the pieces with Mude, looking at the strategic, the ideational, the cultural approaches as being sort of an umbrella, or three definitions under an umbrella of minimalist definitions of populism, which, to your point, are sort of pragmatically delimited to allow for research for the identification of populist actors. But those authors themselves sort of point to the extent to which the definitions don't necessarily provide good causal explanations. And if you read the work of the different authors, they're all sort of constantly kneecapping one another in terms of, oh, well, like your definition leads to these exceptions and your definition leads to these exceptions. And that really bothered me in the sense that I could see why there was so much of an argument around this. And that led me to, I found Laclau's argument to be sort of really exciting, because he offered a definition of populism which was relational as opposed to descriptive, in the sense that he provided a definition of populism which presented it as a form of political instability and not simply as a type of actor. And so it's kind of the difference between like a dagger and a murder weapon, right? Like you can look at a dagger and see that it's a dagger based on the attributes that it has. But if you want to understand what a murder weapon is, it can take on any number of attributes, and it's largely dependent upon context. The significance of the object is tied to it's contextual, it's contextually constitutive, is the term that I use in my work. And that's, I think, that's my answer to that question around what my definition of populism is. And then to the question of what my DV is, what I'm really trying to parse out, I don't know necessarily that I have a specific DV. It would change depending on the analysis and the data that's available, because a lot of what I'm doing is data driven and dependent upon availability, but it's largely focused on trying to understand the extent to which anti-establishment sentiments can be connected to this idea of structural economic variation as an example of the sort of causal factor which can drive the kind of discontent which can serve as the basis for populism. And so in that sense, it's not necessarily so much about the DV as it is about the broader system being the focus of the work.
Hey, thank you. James thanked you for answering his question, but he had a 1 o'clock meeting and so he had to leave. We do have one more question. Andrew, I've opened it up so that you can speak if you'd like.
Is that me?
Yeah, Drew.
Okay, cool, sorry. Thanks, Mike. I really enjoyed the presentation, super interesting. James and Michael Martinez sort of scoops some of the things I wanted to say, but I do have a couple of points maybe about the analysis that you showed, but I will say first, like structural, pun intended, structurally speaking, with regards to the talk, you went for nearly a half hour before you actually got to your stuff, and I think maybe rejiggering how the structure of the talk might help alleviate some of these issues. So just some food for thought. So what do I have left? So on the slide that you're showing us now, one of the bits of your main analysis, I'm sort of looking at these variables here and thinking about some of those pictures you showed us at the beginning, things like manufacturing employment, professional or scientific employment, those things. I'm thinking that all those proportions are probably pretty highly correlated. I'm just wondering about that. And in thinking about the best way to operationalize what you're talking about here, it seems to me that you're saying something like the economic context and the economic transformation of different subnational places within countries is different. Therefore, the relationship between those economic conditions and populism should also be different depending on individual context and subnational context. Is that ish what you were going for?
Yeah, I think that's
okay. Cool. Just wanted to get, so in that case, I would be really interested in seeing a model that looks pretty close to exactly like this, but only focuses on that only has a variable that captures like a negative employment shock to that person's sector. So you have a dummy here, right, where you have the individual I don't know, agriculture job or something like that.
Mhm.
So could you just have a column that captures like whether or not that sector experienced a negative economic shock? Because then that would sort of allow you to avoid all these issues with multicollinearity among all these proportions and really sort of drill down to that individual level mechanism. So that was my first point. The second point is you know, the issue about the population density thing, that doesn't really bother me so much because you know, there's been a lot. There's a pretty high profile, at least, paper that came out a few years ago that basically said people who are doing econometric models like this should only present their putative causal variable of interest, because when you're controlling for all of these confounders, the estimates on those confounders conflate the direct effect of that confounder on the outcome of interest and the total effect that flows through all of the other variables. So you're not really identifying the effect of population density on the outcome. That variable is something like the conditional direct effect of population density that doesn't flow through any of your other variables of interest. So that's all nonsense, but I would just encourage you to think about the causal model at hand and only present the variable or variables that really are pertinent, because then you can avoid all of these types of interpretation issues. But anyway, I think it's a great talk, and be happy to talk more later on.
Yeah, appreciate it. Those are great comments. That all was really helpful, and I really like the idea of looking specifically at the employment shock for the sector specifically, because I mean that, to your point, does get like more directly, I think, at the real theoretical argument that I'm trying to make here. So,
Okay, we have a last follow-up question from Mike Bernard. He writes, following up on James, if populism is a reaction to representation failure, and there are multiple responses to representation failure, how do you know which ones are populist?
So I guess you can interpret this question two ways. Like if there are 3 or 4 parties that are all bidding to address representative failure, the key from the perspective of the argument that Laclau makes is that it has to not be seeking to address the problems from within the sort of hegemonic paradigm of the establishment. So it would have to be a party that is calling for some form of like truly radical change in that sense. But also, I think when parties are reacting to when representative failure occurs and political instability ensues, I don't think there's any reason that you couldn't have multiple parties that are all bidding to sort of take over in the same way that you could have multiple like rebel sects in a country that has sort of had its governance fractured, because it is a kind of political instability, and consequently there are going to be parties that can sort of take on the role of populist in the sense that they can channel the discontent. Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about it, and that's something I'm going to have to think about a little bit more. So thank you for that very good question, Dr. Bernard.
Okay, well, we are officially a little bit over time, but it is a longer talk than we normally have. So I want to thank Michael for his presentation, and I really want to thank everyone who participated, and particularly those who gave him questions and food for thought on ways to improve both his presentation and potentially his research. I would encourage all of those of you who had questions or comments, but maybe didn't have time to ask them, to reach out to Michael and give him your comments and suggestions. Every time we practice, we get a little bit better. So thank you again. And also to those of you who are grad students out there or faculty members who may or may not be working on something Europe related, please remember that CES is happy to serve as a forum for you to get some of this very valuable feedback. And with that, thank you, everyone. And Mike, don't forget, we've got a 3 o'clock meeting. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.